Okay, welcome to this is the second video that has to do with rights, and let's get right to it so we can maybe save a little time. On the first video, talked a little bit about the nature of rights, corresponding duties, negative rights versus positive rights, and considered particularly legal foundations of rights, part one of legal foundations, which is the Constitution. And again, a very critical point here is that constitutional rights are not relevant when it comes to interactions between private parties. No individual nor any private business or organization really takes on any or assumes the burden of respecting a constitutional right. Anyway, that's a basic principle. I don't want to get into a legal quagmire here, but by and large, it's relevant, and it's particularly important when you think about an issue like freedom of speech. But anyway, there are some other legal rights that are very important when it comes to business practices. So let's move on and consider those. So another important area of legal rights has to do with specific laws, statutes, laws that confer upon various people, and including businesses, specific rights and or duties. I've mentioned a few that are in the PowerPoint slides, and let's just illustrate a couple of them. So, for example, the Truth in Lending Act. So, pretty soon, upon graduation, many of you are going to be assuming quote-unquote real lives. You're going to be buying homes. You're going to be purchasing cars. You're going to be entering particularly installment loans and mortgages and things like that. And when the time comes and you do this financing, there's a lot of complicated paperwork that comes your way. But at some point, the lender has to disclose in very simple and understandable terms, in very real terms, what the terms of the loan, what the loan is. So you can sign all kinds of funny contracts and things like that, but at some point, for instance, in a home closing or if you're financing a car, somebody's going to push a piece of paper in front of you, and it has to do with some basic, simple disclosures. This is your right as a consumer, and therefore it's a duty or an obligation on the part of the lender to give you those. It's your right to receive, and it's their duty to give you that information in plain, simple terms in a very specific format. So if you think about that, it has to be a positive right. It's something to which you're entitled and to which they have to give you. It's not particularly, it's not a strong burden, but it is something that you're entitled to, and it's something that the lender is obliged to provide you. The Civil Rights Act, which we could talk an awful lot about because it's probably one of the most important pieces of legislation affecting business. But you're all kind of familiar with the basics, which is a company cannot discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, and national origin. There's some other things that some other laws throw in there, like age and veteran status and some factors like that. But here's an example where an employer, a company, has the burden, or has the duty, not to use these factors when it makes an employment decision. You have a right not to use those, not to have attributes or characteristics like those included in any decision that affects your employment. And that includes not only hiring, but compensation, training, development, all kinds of stuff like that. So if you think about these laws, are very specific in that they confer a specific responsibility on one party or another, and they apply to very specific situations like employment or financing or marketing practices or something like that. Although they may apply fairly broadly. For instance, the Civil Rights Act applies to almost all employers, at least private sector employers in this country. So that they cover a range of activities. They cover a range of, they cover almost everybody. And now this gets us to the third and final category of legal rights, which are sometimes called special rights, or a better way of thinking about it are contractual rights. If I'm a seller and you're a buyer, in the context of our transaction with one another, I have rights and you have duties. For instance, if I'm the seller, I have a right to be paid in a timely fashion. And consequently, it's your obligation, it's your duty to make sure that I am paid. It's also your right to receive goods as promised. So I promise you 100 pounds of shrimp in a contract. I can't try to get by selling you only 90 or 95 pounds of shrimp. So you and I have very specific rights and duties just with respect to one another. And those we voluntarily enter into. These are agreements that apply only to you and I. So they apply to, for instance, a good example are buyers and sellers, employers and employees. If I enter in a contract with you, if I'm the employer, you're the employee, about when you're going to start, how much you're going to get paid, what your job duties are, any other resources I want to give you, any other promises I want to make. They may or may not apply to other employees. So it's an agreement that you and I make. Now, there's an interesting quote in the book, and I'm just going to have you reflect on it, and we'll just leave it at that, which is this quote that Donna Wood shares. It comes from a kind of an international global legal scholar, which is that stateless people have no rights. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on, and I think the statement probably is pretty much directed toward refugees and maybe even specifically the Palestinians, I don't know for sure. But anybody who is not part of a formal state, is not part of, if you will, of a political entity, does not have the rights of citizenship, therefore has no rights. It's an interesting thing to reflect on. And I'm going to ask you to think about that. The other major category of rights, sources of rights, where do we get rights, besides the law, is just what's generally accepted to be correct, due to us because we're humans. And so we'll call these moral rights, and I'm going to go ahead and combine moral rights, human rights. You hear this phrase quite a bit. It's quite relevant when you get into the realm of international business. People think about, do multinational corporations abuse human rights? So, for instance, a lot of times people have fairly weak governments, or they have indifferent governments that aren't protecting their rights to property, aren't protecting their rights to maybe basic rights to education, fair treatment, things like that. And so a company comes into a country like this, and they may make a lot of money, and they may follow the laws of that country. According to the political structure, they're doing everything fine, and they're making some of the corrupt rulers of those countries very, very rich. But what about the masses of people who maybe are working in, well, for instance, the so-called sweatshops? So international corporations face this, quite a bit, the question of moral rights. We don't need a legal framework necessarily to talk about moral rights. I'm going to just kind of acknowledge quickly, but move on, that the work of John Locke, which is another, kind of great European philosopher here, is kind of relevant. That we're born, he was one of the early thinkers who kind of identified these natural rights that all humans come with, and particularly he's quite interested in the idea that our labor and as a matter of fact, our bodies, that we own ourselves, and that our bodies, our mind, and therefore our labor is something that we own and can never be taken from us. And so anything we make or create, this is almost Ayn Randian, anything we make or create inherently belongs to us. So, but another more contemporary way to think about these moral rights, Donna Wood mentions the UN Declaration, or actually it's technically the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So all the members of the United Nations, even though they don't always practice it, but all the members of the United Nations have signed off on this Declaration of Human Rights. And you'll forgive me, I don't have the book in front of me, but I want to say there are about 35 of these, 30 to 35, something like that. Please don't memorize this. Something I like to do in class is I'll have somebody pick a number between 1 and 35 and just randomly, and then we'll look at maybe 2 or 3 of these rights. I don't know in advance which ones we're going to talk about. But some of the ones I've heard people mention and you look at those human rights, in that declaration include things like, you can't be forced into, you can't be forced to work. Basically, slavery is a violation of basic human rights. People have a right to freedom of movement, freedom of association. These are basic rights that all human beings should enjoy: the freedom to practice their own faith, whatever that might be, the freedom to own property. Even communist countries, interestingly, endorse this idea of freedom of property, but it kind of applies more to personal possessions than it does something like, for instance, stock in a company or that sort of thing. Every member nation of the UN has at least formally recognized and is in support of these rights, and this is, if you will, kind of this Universal Declaration is a good guidepost for multinational corporations to follow. There's another scholar who's mentioned in here, who's Tom Donaldson, who introduces the idea of something called hypernorms. And if you've talked about norms, for instance, in any other management class, every organization, there's kind of a way that people are expected to act. And hypernorms must be a way that everyone's expected to act, no matter what the culture, no matter what the organization, no matter what political system or legal system you're part of. There's actually an awful lot of commonality. There's more similarities or commonalities as you go from country to country or culture to culture or religion to religion. There are more similarities than there are differences. So there's, I think, 10. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these, but think about these things. If you take a look at them, what Donaldson is saying and what Wood is putting out there is that doesn't matter what your business is, doesn't matter what part of the world you're operating in, these are the basic rights that you have to expect. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't make any difference whether or not that host government even respects or acknowledges these rights. There's certain basic things that every firm should be prepared to support. I've put a couple of slides here, and I don't want to get too involved in these, and I hope you'll just kind of think of them where I've identified some key groups, key constituents that all businesses face: customers, employees, shareholders, communities, and that with each one of these groups, there's some set of rights that we can identify that they have, which means that there's some set of duties that the corporations owe those groups. That there's duties that companies owe communities, duties that the companies owe employees, customers, shareholders, and the like. And it's something that I think is going to kind of continue to come up over the course of the semester, and maybe even some of our cases, where we'll consider the nature of different groups, different constituents, and some of their rights, some of the claims that they have against businesses that they interact with, businesses that they're affected by. Which brings us to a critical issue which has to do with some of the concerns with rights. Now, I have to admit, I have copied the PowerPoints that I've put up here, and I thought I had included a slide. I was updating some of this file earlier, and there's a slide that feels to me like it's missing. So maybe I'll comment on it and see if I can, after I finish this video up, I'll see if I can't find it. But it addresses one of these points, one of these slides, very directly, which has to do with rights are powerful language. It's a powerful concept because it does place obligations on others. And so naturally we're concerned about, well, what happens when my rights interfere with your rights? Or what happens when there's an overlap? And I want to give you an example a little bit, but for instance, a classic example does have to do with an employer and an employee. We might say that people have a right to privacy, some measure of privacy when it comes to the workplace, what the company can do. Companies are entitled, certainly, they have a right to monitor your work performance. They have a basic right because they own the computers and they, to some extent, own your time, that they have a right to know what you're doing when you're at work, which means that they can monitor your web use, they can monitor your email, they can engage in some basic surveillance. But we ask ourselves, how much surveillance can a company really engage in? So, for instance, can they put cameras or microphones or recording equipment in bathrooms or other places which people typically would expect privacy? What about in parking lots? Or in this day and age, what happens if the company issues you a phone and it's got a GPS tracker on it. And so not only do I track your movements if I send you out, for instance, to call on customers, and you're on the company clock, so to speak, and I want to make sure that even if it's 3:30 on a Friday afternoon and you're tempted to go to happy hour, I want to make sure that you're out there calling on customers. But do I also have a right, for instance, to monitor you whenever I want to, 24/7? This is, this is a huge question. If it's my device and I'm paying for it, what if I give you the phone and I tell you it's okay for you to use it for some personal communications, but then I do monitor those personal communications? What kind of rights do you have? What kind of rights do I have? And there's some complicated questions we have to answer about what happens when these rights begin to conflict with one another. I can't give you a guidepost as far as this is the rule we always use, but just for the moment we'll say that both sides have to carefully reflect on and define exactly what their rights are. And typically in the course of identifying these rights, sometimes at least it becomes clearer, well, whose rights should take priority over someone else's. And of course we have an intricate, complicated set of laws, and we have a judicial system that's going to sort this out. And I was going to, I'm pretty sure, in fact, I had prepared a slide, and I'm going to just kind of share it quickly. Unfortunately, it's not on my printout. But there's a big controversy right now. For instance, it goes back to the state of Arizona, and it's been played out in some states already, about what do we do about people who have religious objections to providing services for gay weddings or civil commitments, same-sex commitment ceremonies, whatever you might want to call them. And so this question came up in the state of Arizona. It was quite controversial. So some people have very genuine good faith religious beliefs that say, listen, there's certain kinds of lifestyles I do not want to endorse, I do not want to be part of, and I should not be compelled to provide services or being involved with something that would seem like I would in some ways endorse it if I were a photographer or a baker or something like that, and I would be compelled to, for instance, provide services for a same-sex commitment ceremony. On the other side, we've got people who are now being recognized, couples who are now being recognized under the laws of various states, and even under the laws to some extent of the federal government, saying, listen, these people have basic rights and we can't deny those rights simply because of the sex of the partner that they choose. So how do we resolve this? There was an interesting resolution. Now, this is a legal resolution, and the way the law sometimes resolves these is, or the way judges resolve them sometimes gets obviously complicated. But I thought this was an interesting resolution to it. In the state of New Mexico, a photographer objected to providing photographic services for a same-sex commitment ceremony. And the New Mexico Supreme Court was asked to rule on this because the state has, like many states, Maryland included, has a no discrimination, or like a human rights amendment, something like that, that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. So what do you do about, somebody says, listen, I have my religion and I have my beliefs, and I shouldn't be compelled to violate those beliefs. And then you've got the state that says, listen, people should not be denied their basic rights simply because, let's say in this case, if they're gay, and if they want to, if they want to go out into the business community and start making contracts, they shouldn't be denied the opportunity to receive the same services that a opposite sex couple would have. So the New Mexico State Supreme Court ruled that everyone has the right to their religion, and everyone has a right to freedom of expression under the law. So, for instance, if I object to same-sex marriage just on principle, and I think it's wrong, I think it's bad public policy, and obviously there are many people who do believe that way, I can express my views, I can put it on my website, I can put it on my business cards, I can wear t-shirts, I can do whatever I can paint it on the company van or the company truck, whatever it is, about, we're, endorsing traditional values since 1985, whatever that might be. But when it comes to if a same-sex couple were to approach that person and say, we want to contract with your business for services, they cannot be denied. So you still have the freedom of speech, but you can't use the freedom of speech to deny the same-sex couple their rights to receive those services if they so choose. This is more a principle. There's a practical matter. Do you think that a same-sex couple is going to go, find a photographer who so blatantly endorses traditional values, so to speak? Practically speaking, they would probably want to find somebody else to take pictures at their ceremony. But if, again, the principle applies, what if the same-sex couple were to say, you're the best photographer in this town, and we happen to know that, and we've seen your work, and no matter what your views are, we think you'd be the perfect photographer or caterer or whatever service you provide. You'd be perfect for our commitment ceremony. We want you, and you're just going to have to put up with it. There is a distinction now between the person and their personal views and then the business, which is in the public arena and has to provide a service to the public. And when you are a business and you're in the public arena and you have to provide services to the public, there's certain rules the public demands that you follow. Anyway, it's an interesting, if you will, I don't want to call it a compromise, but it's an interesting way of resolving this idea of conflicting rights. So I hope that helps. And I'm at 21 minutes, which is a little longer than I typically like to go, but I hope this helps. And the next topic is justice. And thanks for your patience on these.